There's a pattern of behavior and announcements from President Trump which add to uncertainty. It's unnerving on a variety of levels because of the repercussions directly in terms of the Gulf, of course, but globally too. Massive uncertainty. This is beyond that, with the potential to become catastrophic. What's going to happen in Tehran? I'm not positive until we find something internally. First of all, the action shouldn't have happened. We should have thought of more intellectual and other forms to be able to remove the regime in Tehran. And I think that it's tragic that they remain, IRGC remains in place. If the action continues, if the kinetic action continues, very concerned about more direct engagement of China and Russia. If that happens, then our discussions are meaningless. I have to say, it's not in the direct line of fire, no drones, for example, that it hasn't been a target. Egypt's made itself clear there are no foreign bases on its soil. It's having to deal with existing problems as much as anything from the Gulf. I think that the IMF is a solution in the short term to be able to make sure that you're able to just return to the IMF as its supplier of capital. The markets in Egypt have already seen exits of investors from its debt. I think it's going to be difficult. There's still liquidity, though, domestically, of course, very strong domestic liquidity. Difficult, though, I think, to come to the international markets until there's calmer waters.
I'd like to reintroduce my guest from 2 years ago, our 2-year anniversary, Angus Blair. Angus, welcome back to Majlis Markets, this time on video.
Thank you very much. It makes quite a difference, I have to say.
Yes. We did it. I was just saying to you before we recorded on April the 12th, 2024, and that was a really great episode. I think it was episode 13, if I'm not mistaken. I'll link it in the show notes. But Angus, that was a really great, episode that we did on Egypt at the time. Very different world to what we're living in now. I really want to talk to you today about what's going on with Iran. Obviously, every hour it seems to be changing the situation, and it seems to be getting a little bit worse, a little bit better, like just depending on how everyone wakes up on which side of the bed they're waking up. Angus, I really want to get into it from the get-go. To kick off, what were your thoughts when Donald Trump announced they were going to be attacking Iran on February?
Well, there's a pattern of behavior and announcements from President Trump which add to uncertainty. And this was another, even though I have to say there was a lead up to this. Nevertheless, we had assumed that the kinetic action against Iran was complete last year. So there must be other issues with regard to why this took place now. The market doesn't know what these details are. The security establishment may or may not. There may be other reasons as to why this took place that haven't yet been made. But it's unnerving, Hassan, in a variety of levels because of the repercussions directly in terms of the Gulf, of course, but globally too. Massive uncertainty. And as you know, and most people listening, market uncertainty is the last thing anyone wants. We can deal with small movements, of course, and there have been economic shocks historically. And of course, we've had that several times in my working career. This is beyond that, with the potential to become catastrophic if fertilizer use continues to fall because it's not available or too expensive, and other forms of effects, whether that be harvests later in the year, food price inflation later in the year, where it will show up the inefficiency of monetary policy, and of course the direct economic impact across much of the GCC, with the expectation at any moment that shock might widen. In terms of where we are, initial shock followed by further shocks, followed by, oh dear, what's happening? And I think much of the initial media discussion when they were talking about off-ramps, and I'm thinking, no, this is quite a different issue. It's a much bigger issue than last year. And of course, anything that either of us say now might be out of date in a day or two, never mind a few months' time.
Yeah, no, I don't envy your job when having to advise people and advise companies and talk about how to plan, because like as you just said just now, right, what we could be talking about right now could be obsolete within the next hour or two, or even let alone the next day or week or month. But Angus, there's always been talk of America or Israel, or the two of them attacking Iran. There's always been this rhetoric even since 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, and then obviously the events since then. But now it's happened for real. And I think a lot of people got shocked of how much it's escalated, and the attack on the Iranian retaliatory attacks on Gulf countries, on their Gulf neighbors, and not just military institutions with the US and all of these things, but also civilian targets as well, especially to do with things like trade, tourism, logistics. Were you surprised that the Iranians did that?
Well, first of all, their action is two-way in terms of whether it's an attack on the school or now on infrastructure, which harms the whole of the economy, not just the IRGC. I think that any watcher of Iran, and one thing, if you're an investor across emerging markets, one always looks at geopolitical risk. Always, perhaps more than everyday politicians in the West who come and go as ministers. And I think that when one sees what Iran has been doing, it's been building up, preparing for this, because there's already been sanctions which improved their own domestic military production. Even when I lived in Saudi a long time ago, and then visiting other GCC states before I moved to Egypt, the fact was that they were worried about Iranian terror cells. So I think that, and they're very clever. They've had time to think out the responses. So it's a shock. And of course, our friends in the GCC are hurting because it's attacking their infrastructure, whether it's hydrocarbons, it's harming the leisure industry as well, or just widespread hits by these drones coming across that could hit any home, a school, hospital, or other building at any time. So that uncertainty means that there are huge problems. So I think it's going to be very difficult, even if it ended tomorrow, to mend relations with Iran for quite a long time, assuming the power structure, which is, as you know, incredibly malignant, remains in place.
We had an episode a few episodes ago with an Iranian specialist, and just the complexities of the Iranian political system and the military apparatus. I think Donald Trump and some of the military advisors, I don't think really thought about this in their calculus. Do you think that the way that this war has been conducted so far has been a bit reckless? It hasn't been like a conventional way of attacking a country, right?
It's not conventional, I have to say, but I'm not a military planner. I think the American military is very efficient in terms of the execution of whatever it has to do in terms of military duties. I think that strategy is the issue here in handling what is a malignant problem. I saw it up close in Syria, Lebanon, and then indirectly in Iraq and in Yemen, of what it means for the rest of the world, never mind the GCC. So I think that it's unusual in that one has to observe. But that's where I think that it's better, I think, if you ever interview somebody who studies military action and security issues, would be better than those of us who observe. Solid observers is still insufficient in terms of what's happening. But I remain concerned about the effect of this action, kinetic action, growing, particularly if there's some form of intervention from China or Russia, more than is happening already. And you see that from the Chinese spy ship at the Gulf of Oman. So rather concerning, all of it.
What was interesting, Angus, is that, the Gulf countries over the past couple of decades, and especially in the last decade, have been really focusing a lot on economic diversification. They're trying to diversify away from fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. They've tried to open their capital markets. They've tapped the international capital markets. They've tried to attract tourism, trying to attract FDI. But do you think now that the efforts of diversification have been impacted and will be set back quite a long time, or do you think it will bounce back once, hostilities end?
Well, I have to say there's been a very solid growth in the non-oil economy across the GCC. Really, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates particularly, although Oman has been stepping up because of the low level of oil revenues. I like Oman, I would say, very much. But if we focus on Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates, there has been very significant push to diversify. Some of that was due to the sanctions, in Qatar's case, to the sanctions on it by its neighbours. It helped really transform its own supply chains and domestic production. But here we are now, where the Emirates has around 150,000 hotel rooms. That's about the same as London, where Emirates employs roughly about 120,000 people. About a quarter of that will be cabin crew. And the same for Etihad or now in Saudi or Qatar Airways, which are having to store planes in Spain. So where are we in this? Well, first of all, there's a direct hit. But you've seen a very significant growth in flights again to in and out of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, less so Qatar. But the diversification is both a strength and a weakness. Diversification into the leisure and hospitality sector is shown as a weakness short term. Can they survive it? Well, there are enormous fiscal buffers in both Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates particularly, and Qatar. Sovereign wealth funds are on hand to help. They can recalibrate their assets, and they have been doing so, particularly the PIF in Saudi Arabia, cutting stakes, stopping programs, which I have to say were rather unusual in the first place. But the recalibration has been quick, and that's good. So the strength, for example, in, say, the sovereign wealth funds in the Emirates, the fiscal buffers in terms of what they have in reserve, and in Saudi Arabia, particularly Qatar, they will help significantly. But if you see the news today from Wall Street Journal and reported by Bloomberg that the Emirates are in preliminary discussions with the Americans about some support, tells you that it's hurting. Can they bounce back from this? Yes. Enormously clever, agile, creative thinkers, especially in the Emirates. We could do with some of that thinking here. I saw a report only the other day from Margaret Thatcher criticising Heathrow Airport when she'd been through Dubai Airport and congratulating the now Sheikh Maktoum when his father was in charge, because Sheikh Maktoum was in charge of developing Dubai Airport. She was impressed and said, can we just follow what Dubai is doing? Very good creative thinkers in terms of planning for the future. And I think there's much that the rest of us can learn. So they can bounce back and probably could do quickly, assuming there's peace, very quickly in the hospitality sector in the Emirates, and for the use of airlines in Qatar and so on, Etihad, Emirates, and in Saudi Arabia to grow its economy further. I think FDI may take a bit of a hit because it will take a bit longer, I think, to reassure direct investors. So I think short term, major problems, longer term recovery, but will still be areas of caution, I think, amongst some direct investors.
What about the ones you referenced, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, but what about the more weaker countries, say like Bahrain or Oman, and even Kuwait, which has a large sovereign wealth fund, they've been hit quite badly. Do you think that they'll be able to recover quicker?
I think in terms of investment in this oil and gas sector, but I have to say, having been to Kuwait quite a number of times in the past, it's quite interesting. It's a city-state. Most of its income invested goes overseas. That's not going to change. There'll be marginal inputs domestically. So I think that what you'll see in Kuwait will be much as it was before. Not really a home for indirect investment. It's never a market that's excited me. Qatar, I think, will be fine. But the other two, Bahrain and Oman. Bahrain will have support, almost a life support from Saudi Arabia that won't disappear. In terms of some of its more assertive acquisitions potentially overseas, I don't think will happen at the moment or for maybe for some years. Oman is a different kettle of fish under the new, relative new sultan. The changes in governance with much better people in charge, I think that the focus on trying to develop the economy, I like very much. And I think that this Broom and the role it plays, I have to say, magnificent role in being a peacemaker in a world full of aggressiveness, I also applaud very much. And the foreign minister of what they have tried to do in this issue in the Gulf. Oman needs more. It may need some help from the IMF, but it's on a path that had already started before this kinetic campaign. So Kuwait, much as before, Bahrain, problems. Oman may need some help, but will continue its course on diversification.
Of course, Angus, it's very well known that Iran and Iraq fought a war in the 80s, between 1918 and 1988. That was a very bloody war. But when you talk to people, in the Gulf or in Iran, a lot of people say that this war is very different because the main crux, or one of the key cruxes, is the Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow strait of where about, I think, 20% of the world's oil and other minerals and other fertilizers and other kind of goods go through. The thing that's interesting to me, Angus, is that I don't think a lot of people in the Western countries, or indeed in Iran itself, really thought that Iran would be able to, take control of this strait and now actually using the strait as a bargaining chip. Do you think a lot of people were thinking about that?
I think that the whole issue about the Strait of Hormuz is concerning on a variety of levels. And I think that there hadn't been enough, when we talked earlier about the strategy issues, I think this is the issue, is that those who were making decisions, I'm not talking about the American and other military here, it was the politicians, I think didn't realize what would happen. Something in business which you will know is something I learned very, very early on, especially in mergers and acquisitions. You don't make an acquisition or make a merger until you're happy with the downside. I don't think they'd worked out the downside. So with the Strait of Hormuz, for example, my concern is that the way you have this theocratic military regime in Tehran can continue to be malignant and is just waiting for the right time to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. The fact that we're already facing problems is already built into the global economic system in fertilizers and so on. So I think that recovering from the Hormuz being closed can happen quickly. But there are already built-in problems for months in terms of fertilizers and, as I mentioned, particularly supply of oil, jet fuel already happening short term. So I don't think this is going to be easy. I think it's going to call on military from a variety of countries to step in to try to control the safety of transit for quite some time. But again, that's where I think a security analyst would be far better than somebody in the markets.
Yeah, I think a lot of people. I just think a lot of people didn't think about that because this strait, right? So it was people didn't have to ships didn't have to pay any kind of like toll or tax or any kind of thing, but now it seems going forward in any kind of solution, whether it be diplomatic or any kind of thing, Iran would expect to be using the Strait of Hormuz as a political bargaining chip, whether to make extra.
I don't think, Hassan. I don't think the neighbours in the Gulf will be happy with that, no matter what happens. They will. The Emirates have already said that this is a form of extortion by the Iranians. And the fact that, albeit the strait is in Omani and Iranian waters, and it's not an international channel in the middle, it's being used for trade, albeit it's in the maritime borders. But the fact is that if any one country in the Gulf says it's extortion, then that's the same for all of them. They will have to find other measures to find a way around this. It may be kinetic, I hope not, or a change in regime in Tehran. It is problematic. I think the easier solution would be to pay, but it's not a long-term solution.
We had a guest on a few episodes ago, and he mentioned, it doesn't matter if oil's at 120 or 150. If you can't export your oil, then there's really no point having, you can't really do anything about that. So, like, even if oil prices do go really sky high, if the strait is closed, then they can't export it, right?
Absolutely.
Angus, I really want to also talk to you today about a country close to your heart, which is Egypt. It's the most populous country in the Arab world. It's a very important country historically and politically, even today. What kind of an impact has the Iran conflict had on Egypt and its economy?
Directly, I have to say, it's not in the direct line of fire. No drones, for example, it hasn't been a target. Egypt's made itself clear there are no foreign bases on its soil. It's having to deal with existing problems, Hassan, as much as anything from the Gulf. There may be some spillover from tourism. There's been enormously strong recovery in tourism, about 19% growth last year. Fantastic growth, much needed for the economy to help the hospitality sector in Egypt. Also much helped by the opening of the new museum, which is a global draw. And I'm seeing far more people now going to Egypt than was the case before, even now. And you have to remember that even as Yemeni drones were flying over Sinai, going to Israel in the past, the fact that tourists were still going increasingly to Egypt. Indirectly, there are problems, concerns over what the Houthis may do in the Red Sea, and over the indirect impact costs, for example, of oil and gas, meaning that subsidy costs in Egypt, even though they have diminished those subsidies, the subsidy costs will rise. Remittances, which I've discussed with the rating agencies recently, keep a watch out for as many frequent numbers on the release of remittances as possible, just to monitor them regularly. There was a $41 billion remittances into Egypt last year. It says may come off a bit. Trade may be hit, will be hit from the Gulf. So I think I'm concerned about that. Fertilizer prices. So it's the fact that even though Egypt is doing as much as possible to fight back against historic problems, it may yet be insufficient to mounting higher prices of oil and gas. Fertilizer costs, as you know, for the Delta is incredibly important for the average farmers in Egypt who don't have much revenue. Tourism may take some hit as they're moved to elsewhere in the Mediterranean, particularly. Morocco may benefit. Southern Europe will benefit. But the tourism numbers, I think, initially looked to be a little harmed, but actually seem to be relatively fine so far. So Egypt's playing a straight course. One thing, though, I'd say in Egypt, which remains important, is that the effects of the problems next door in Libya and, of course, in Sudan are highly problematic, and always having to keep a watch on all of these issues and having to monitor and calibrate your policies against which are incredibly strong headwinds. So I think may call upon some support from the IMF to come in and support, as the IMF will have to do against a whole variety of countries this year.
How would you characterize Egypt's sovereign debt at the moment? Do you think it's sustainable, or do you think they're going to have to go back to the IMF eventually?
Well, I think that the IMF is a solution in the short term to be able to make sure that you're able to just return to the IMF as its supplier of capital in terms of the marketplace. It's quite difficult, I think, in this market for many emerging markets to raise capital, albeit China, I don't know if you noticed, raising about $12 billion in 30-year bonds, testing the market for its very long-term issuance. But I think across all of Africa, Latin America, plus Asia, the IMF is going to be a big lender. The markets in Egypt have already seen exits of investors from its debt. I think it's going to be difficult. There's still liquidity, though, domestically, of course, very strong domestic liquidity. Difficult, though, I think, to come to the international markets until there's calmer waters in terms of the GCC actions. They themselves may also need support, as we just mentioned with the IMF, not the IMF, with the US. The fact that whether the Wall Street Journal article is true, that's been reported on Bloomberg about the Emirates asking America for help, is interesting. I think we have to wait to see if there's any more formal response in time about that. But I think that for Egypt, the sooner everything stops, the better for the indirect action. But the moment the Houthis try to stop trade going through the Red Sea, then that adds to problems because, Saudi Arabia has been trying to move oil out through its pipeline to the Red Sea. Some of it will go through the Suez Canal, of course. Other ships will be going down through the Red Sea south. Problematic. So I remain concerned about Egypt, but compared to problems in the past, it's better decision makers who seem to have more power than they did in the past, thank goodness, be able to do what needs to be done. So a mixed picture, really.
And the Egyptian pound, are you not concerned of how things are going there with that?
It's now moving. I remember after 2016, I was visited by the IMF teams and World Bank teams when I was in Egypt, and early in 2017, they said that they were assured that there was a free movement of the Egyptian pound then. I said a straight line relationship with the dollar means otherwise. However, the weakness in the Egyptian pound against the dollar is not surprising. Many countries have become weaker against the dollar. As you know, the dollar has been pretty strong the last month. Gold has weakened. I personally bullish on gold and silver, perhaps others at the moment. So the weakness is a positive sign of good response to what is a market problem and supply problem. So I think that they're doing the right thing. Let it weaken. It shows you're doing the right thing. And I think that confidence will return because they're doing the right thing.
Angus, you mentioned something just now, which just came to my mind, was, if the GCC countries themselves get into a little bit of trouble, and the UAE, particularly Abu Dhabi, provided a big credit pledge to Egypt, I think in 2024, to prop up the economy and the currency. How, if things do get a little bit tight for some of the GCC investors in Egypt, how could that feed into Egypt's economy?
Well, you have to remember, I think, Hassan, that investment was direct as well as deposit in the central bank. It was, the majority of it is on a development on payment for land on the north coast, Mediterranean coast of Egypt. It's a huge real estate investment, which did help support the Egyptian pound. I think the GCC states have made it absolutely clear, no more help that we can wave goodbye to. It has to be invested in something. So you had the Egyptian Saudi Investment Fund set up, run by the PIF in Saudi, to invest in companies in Egypt. That's great. Supporting the stock market, supporting companies, investing in Egypt for the longer term. Saudi Arabia, too, is looking at real estate development, as is Qatar. So the development from the Emirates and others, I think, will come in directly. But at the moment, their eyes are elsewhere. If Egypt really needs help, then it will get it, I think, if it really needs it for the short term. But the IMF will be there to help too.
And the point about, the Red Sea, geopolitical analysts told me that could become a very big challenge if the Houthis do decide to, get more involved with what's happening with Iran. How could that impact the Suez Canal?
There were, in the 2023, there was about $9 billion revenue from the Suez Canal, dropped significantly thereafter from the Houthi attacks. There's been some recovery, thank goodness. I haven't seen the more recent numbers for the whole year, for the last fiscal year, but it was down. I know it was down because they were reporting some numbers on a quarterly basis. It's down dramatically. That's also problematic for foreign exchange reserves because they're relying now more on tourism to bring in income. So if the Houthis decided to up the ante on that traffic, I think you would find immediate kinetic action against Yemen, which would mean that it's easier to take out threats from Houthis than anything in Iran. So you would see immediate fight back to help restore confidence that the Houthis are a spent force. Plus also the Iranian regime itself is much weakened and it's very difficult to influence, thank goodness, its malignant influence across the region than it did before. You see that in Syria and to an extent, albeit weakened, but still strong, and the Hezbollah also malignant. I think it would be quite easy to take out military action, take out what remains of Houthi action, and keep ships down by Yemen to ensure that the Red Sea could be free and traffic can move freely. This isn't like the Hormuz. It's easier to do with the Red Sea. So the recovery in Suez traffic could be easier, but it may call for action in the short term.
Angus, if things do get worse in Hormuz, that there could be some kind of energy crisis in Egypt?
Well, I look to the agreement between Israel and Egypt about supplying Egypt with gas from its fields, Leviathan and others. I think that may help give some support. Also, you have to remember that there are internal issues with Egypt to cut demand. We saw that before aid, for example, and the plan after aid, where the plan was to close shops early, much earlier, shopping malls and so on, to keep only emergence grocery shops and others open after 9 o'clock, close restaurants by 9 o'clock too. As you know, it's not a very Egyptian thing. As you know, everyone stays up late, one of its attractions of life. But the fact is they were able to take action to reduce energy demand. If that happens, they would look again. And of course, I lived there throughout when we had energy cuts, electricity supply cuts on a regular basis in the past. I don't think they need to do that quite yet. I think the solution would be to close up early. It's healthier for the economy, manageable. It may damage the economy a little, but helps in managing the supplies of their energy.
Where does China fit in all of this with Egypt? Egypt's a member of BRICS. I think it's a member of NDB, the New Development Bank, as well. Where does China fit in within the Egyptian economy?
Well, the issue of China is a regional issue, very much as China's been taking a very long view everywhere. It's not like the Western powers or investors take very much a short-term view. It's building up and building up. As you know, before I move on to what it means for Egypt, particularly, China's been electrifying and ring-fencing its whole economy for some years. And that electrification is enormous. They put in a day what some countries would do in a year in terms of solar panels. So I think there's much to learn from their approach. China, it's quite interesting in the discussions before I again move to Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, basically saying to America, if we're going to export oil, we may do so in the yuan rather than the dollar. That would threaten dollar strength. That is perhaps an indirect threat to stop kinetic action in Iran and come to an agreement. Egypt's further behind that in terms of the importance. First of all, the sheer size of the economies in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, Qatar, are much higher. However, Egypt's an important economy and important geopolitically. And you see that in the relationship that's been built between President Sisi, who's made a number of visits to Beijing to meet President Xi. And I think what Egypt's been trying to do, and you see it also with visits to Putin in Sochi and Moscow, is that President Sisi and the team around him have been trying to balance the geopolitical relationships to make sure they're not really, are they playing one against the other? I wouldn't really say that. I say that for them, they're balancing their interests. And that means China will remain a key player in Egypt. It's not been an enormous investor, unlike India. India's invested significantly into the chemical sector. Very good, very quiet, long-term investors. China's been building up increasingly along the Suez Canal zone and has won some different government supports, being able to employ more numbers of Chinese than other companies, including Western companies' investments, for example. So that's appealing to China because Egypt still remains a big domestic market for its goods. And I think that Egypt will remain a key player for them to grow investment directly in manufacturing longer term.
What are your thoughts on this idea that's been floated around by certain commentators like Tucker Carlson that if you take out the Iranian regime and you take out Israel's goals, do you see this as like a play out between, say, the US and China over who, controls this region of the world?
First of all, you have to frame it against what Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying for decades about Iran. It's long been a target for him and the people around him. So I wouldn't ignore that element of why we have such major kinetic action again within 12 months. I think with China, there is possible issues in terms of the team around President Trump as to try to control various elements of the economic growth of China. That would be for somebody who's a Washington watcher, I think, to answer. than us. We can speculate, but I don't think we have sufficient evidence. I think the engagement of Israel in this is far greater in terms of what's happened than trying to limit the supply of oil for China. China has gone electrified so much in the last decade. Strategic oil reserve has built up other reserves, has also calibrated itself by saying it will stop the export of key materials, including rare earth materials, which has come as a bit of a shock. The one issue is, if you do something, there are always repercussions. I don't think this issue has been thought through sufficiently on a whole variety of levels. Or if it is, then it's an action that we're unprepared for. And that therefore we have to look at the deeper reasons as to why we are where we are, because it doesn't really make sense. A year after significant kinetic action, we are now where we are, unless something else has happened, or that there's been a change in priorities. And that is beyond, I think, knowledge of me and others in the markets.
Yeah, to me, it's just kind of astonishing that I think a lot of the mainstream media are shocked that the Iranian regime is still intact, and the fact that they don't really understand that, taking out leaders doesn't necessarily mean it will end the collapse of a regime, right? And then at the same time, people are not talking about what's happening with Israel and the construction of the Ben Gurion Canal to try and export things out of there. So I guess
I haven't heard. I don't think that will be built. I think the Suez Canal is in place. I don't think it's going to be efficient.
That's part of their calculus there.
Don't think it's going to happen.
Really? Okay, that's interesting. Like when
I think the Israelis have far better use of their capital than building another canal to compete with the Suez Canal. There may be pipelines for oil to go up through Jordan, but they won't go to Haifa. They'll go up through Syria to either Lebanon or the coast of Syria.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that because, it's quite interesting. Ahmad al-Shara, I can't really read him that well because, although he's, been in power for nearly 2 years now, he kind of has like a weird relationship with Israel. And obviously Israel's, been pounding Lebanon for the last, I don't know how long. And Lebanon, obviously, from Iran's perspective, is like a big part of any kind of agreement that they do have with the US eventually. What are your thoughts on like something like that? Do you see like a relationship there between Ahmad al-Shara and Israel happening there?
This is interesting because it plays on psychology as well as theology. Ahmed has been a terrorist, but there have been other people who've been called terrorists in the past who were brought into the political system, but very different supposed terrorists, not least in Nelson Mandela, who was very far from what Ahmed al-Shara was doing in Syria. I'd met the previous regime in Syria a number of times. Bashar al-Assad, for example, in the early days, 20 years ago, we were trying to make the private sector grow beyond the influence of the then Alawite regime at the top of Iran and the secret services around Bashar al-Assad. We had some success. The British Syrian Society and banking particularly, and the growth in the private sector for a while worked. So you're asking someone who's come from relatively simple background, dangerous background, to try to transform. And he's on a learning curve, realizing being in charge means you're going to have to do things you may disagree with to have the outcome that's best for everyone and not for him and the people around him. And of course, the relationship with Israel, having taken the Golan in 1967, remains highly problematic for many people. But then again, many people were hurt under the dreadful regime of al-Assad and under ISIS and Daesh and others in Syria. I know so many people who had to leave Syria because of what. So I'm not surprised it's going to be a very difficult relationship. I don't think it's going to be easy to make peace between either parties, especially with Netanyahu and his cabinet. Meanwhile, what they're doing, I think the attack between Israel and Lebanon on the whole of Lebanon, not just Hezbollah, is problematic, not just for Iran. Of course, they've taken it under the belt, but Hezbollah is a weakening force, thank goodness. The government in Beirut is also weak. Very difficult control group. That's a terrorist group which has arms that at any moment may attack any politician or related families. So it's not easy. None of this is easy to sort. But you need different mechanisms and different people. It's not going to work with the current government in Jerusalem or in Damascus, unless he transforms and has much better technocratic people around him and on the ground around the country and don't rely on sheikhs to decide policy. So I think that the issue of Lebanon is more complex because you also have a supporter of Lebanon in President Macron, thank goodness, because I'm very familiar with Lebanon. It needs enormous support. And as you know, at the moment, the disruption in the south goes well beyond Hezbollah facilities. So more problematic than we can discuss, I think, today.
It just annoys me, when you watch people like Piers Morgan or any of these mainstream media, is that they always say Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, which, I mean, it does receive support and, money from Iran, but it's Lebanese resistance movements against Israel occupying Lebanon in 1982, right?
Yes, that's the way it started, but it also received enormous funds over time, without any doubt. The way in which Hezbollah has been able to support people fiscally, monetarily, I should say, across its supporters, meant that it was getting support, albeit at a very dodgy operations internationally, which the Fed has US Treasury has come down on too, looking at their operations and getting people and sanctioning people to stop whatever they were doing and funneling money back to Hezbollah. Hezbollah did receive very significant funds from Tehran, so hopefully that stopped and it can help diminish Hezbollah further, because it's been itself a very malignant force, setting up its own telecom system, threatening a whole variety of people, domestically and anyone who tried to find out what was happening. So the sooner Hezbollah ends, the better.
Just going back to your point about, the Lebanese government, which has been basically bankrupt since 2019, I haven't heard anything. We've heard a lot of pledges from the French and some other people of a plan and everything, but in the past, I haven't really heard anything about, any kind of fiscal help to really solve Lebanon's, debt crisis. And I don't really see the central government really having the ability to do anything, counter Hezbollah at this point in time. Do you see any way forward for the Lebanese government to try and get ahead?
Well, first of all, you have to still sort out the banks, the shareholder issue and the depositor issue, and sort out those who benefited from what really was a crime. Everyone's been pointing at the governor of the central bank, but it's a wider systemic issue in the banking sector in Lebanon, and also within Lebanon, the different sects in control of different banks, they're also party to the problem. And I think that it's going to call for different figures within the IMF, the World Bank and others to sort it out and give support. And the European Union, say through the European Investment Bank and so on, they would, or the EBRD. There are always great people in the EBRD and EIB wanting to help, but their counterparties in Lebanon historically have been really pretty poor. For the hope of Lebanon, there is tremendous talent in Lebanon, as there is in Egypt, tremendous talent that can resolve so many problems, as they have done in the Gulf historically, creative thinkers, people who I think would take do the right thing. A lot of people in financial services. All you have to do is look at HSBC, now run by Lebanese George Al-Hedri, who I've met, and was always good when I met him in Dubai historically. The fact that talent is there wanting to help. But you have to resolve the banking issue first and be able to supply some of that capital back to the depositors to be able to help the economy at a day-to-day level. And then later, the IMF and World Bank and other counterparties, multinational investment bank, finance institutions can come in and help and then support it. But let me also say in this, because I mentioned Egypt, one thing about Egypt is there's been a change of thinking necessarily in the last few years because of problems. Just historic ways of taking decisions didn't work. So it's great to see bring in people like Hassan Abdullah, Ahmed Kachuk and others, and people who really sorting out problems and realizing they have to work in concert rather than through silos, be able to sort out problems. I mean, I've worked with tremendous talents in Egypt, that some of my former investment banking and investment research analysts, superb people who could be, again, supportive future central bank governors, ministers of finance, or general ministers in total, or various others at UC, where I was a professor for a while. Superb talent. So I think that when you look at a problem, you have to look at what helps at the bottom first. So going back to Lebanon, sort out the banking problem, get capital back in the hands of everyday depositors. That will then help the economy and then provide some form of stability to grow something, because at the moment that can't happen. But you need to stop the kinetic action in the south and get that land also, which includes a lot of farmland, back in the hands of the Lebanese to be able to provide some different support at a variety of levels.
Yeah, but to do that right now seems very far away, right?
Yeah, you can't do it with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his colleagues in charge at the moment. I don't think that's going to happen, except there's only one voice that can stop it, is President Trump. And you can see that he has some ear to the Lebanese, but he could really say stop it right now, and the Israelis would have to stop it. So I think that he's the only voice who could stop all of the kinetic action in the south of Lebanon.
As we bring the podcast to a close, where do you see things going right now in the war? We're recording this on the 20th of April. There seems to be more talks happening in Islamabad in the next few days. Do you see things going positively, or do you see things escalating again?
I'm not altogether sure that the discussions can take place. There are already infighting between the Iranian delegations, IRGC, and the politicians. So it's very difficult when you've got a counterparty in Iran that's fighting amongst themselves. The IRGC is run like a mafia, controlling the whole of Iran and its people. It's run executing people across the country, as we've seen over the last few months, still continues to do so. That regime can't survive in its form because it's not a solid counterparty, especially for the Iranians, of course, first. As a counterparty in discussions, I don't think the quality of discussants from the American side has been good historically. There were great people in the State Department, but they have disappeared and not invited. And I think when you have a real estate investor and a fund manager involved in negotiations as your main protagonist in this discussion, doesn't say much for the American discussants in terms of quality. I would have brought in really good, seasoned people from the State Department instead. Pakistanis and others, Malaysians and so on, even Egyptians behind the scenes and Turks, working to say, look, can we try and work out a solution? Good for them. I think the main problem, now the action has started, is what's going to happen in Tehran. I'm not positive until we find something internally. First of all, the action shouldn't have happened. We should have thought of more intellectual and other forms to be able to remove the regime in Tehran. And I think that it's tragic that they remain, the IRGC remains in place. If the action continues, if the kinetic action continues, I'm very concerned about more direct engagement of China and Russia. If that happens, then our discussions are meaningless.
What's ironic to me is I remember, studying the JCPOA back in 2015 and writing about it, and a lot of people were complaining about it. Donald Trump, most of the people complaining about it, but it seems now any kind of agreement they do eventually get will probably be worse than what he had a decade ago.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, you don't do something unless you're ready to live with the consequences and the downside risks weren't looked at, I think, sufficiently. And so there may be other reasons for this beyond our knowledge.
For sure. Angus Blair, tell us any projects you're working on or any upcoming projects you may be working on.
Working with investment institutions on emerging markets, continuing and advising direct investors and especially risk committees of global companies. I find that it is intellectually interesting. But my heart is in the City of London still in finance, so all the knowledge I've gained is hopefully is still being put to use, but could be hopefully put to use for some years yet.
Amazing. Angus Blair, this has been a great catch up, and we'll catch up again soon. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Hassan.